Welcome. A few more people might come. I think this is a new space for people to find as an event space. So I'm delighted with the view and with all the faces I recognize. So welcome. I'm Kaija Schilde. I'm the director of the Center for the Study of Europe here. And one of the areas that we have been focused on at the center, and this is our inaugural talk to start this series, is a series called Decentering Europe. And so it's a little bit strange to have a center focused on Europe, but where I have a theme of decentering Europe, but we're not really interested in having a conversation just about Europe. We're interested in the Europe as a site of socio-cultural or economic production that interacts with the rest of the world, or is informed by or produced by Europe's relationship with non-European spaces, or its legacy, the actions of European political entities or economic entities or cultural entities outside of Europe, and vice versa, the influence of non-European political, cultural, and economic entities inside Europe. So with that, I'm incredibly excited to announce our speaker today, Hans Kundnani, who's going to be talking about his brand new book, Eurowhiteness. And I'm not going to read out the whole title or anything because I forgot my notes. But I have been looking forward to this book for a very, very long time. I have a few comments about that. I'll be moderating, but I'm more interested in hearing from you. I have one or two comments, but if I have more, I'll save them for later. But I really welcome all of your comments afterwards. This is part of how we hope this session goes. But I've been looking forward to this book for a very long time. It has been something that I've been trying to articulate for 20 years. That only Hans has been able to articulate recently. And it's getting a lot of press. We were just talking about how there was a review of it in the Wall Street Journal editorial pages today, which I haven't yet read because I've been teaching all day, but Hans told me about it a little bit. But a background on Hans is that he has been traveling a lot of EU policy spaces for definitely over a decade. In different EU think tanks. He's an associate fellow at Chatham House. And currently he is on leave from that position, not on leave from that position, but not at that position because he's funded by the Open Societies Foundation and will be in various visiting research positions in the United States, including at NYU next semester. Also, I hope to bring him back and have this be the beginning of a longer conversation. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you so much, Kaija. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's great to be here. As you say, it's a really cool space and the weather's beautiful, so I'm in a good mood. I'll try to kind of be relatively brief because I want us to have a discussion rather than me giving a long lecture. And in a way, that's also sort of the spirit of the book as well, is that it's really meant to start a conversation rather than pretending to be definitive or exhaustive. It's a very short book. It covers a lot of ground. And really what it's trying to do is raise a bunch of questions, which I think need to be asked, rather than try to give definitive answers to them. It's also, and this maybe is a good place to start my remarks, is written from a very particular kind of personal perspective. And so I'll say a little bit about that, about what sort of led me to write the book, and then I'll sort of try to outline the argument of the book a little bit. It's a personal book because I mean, from I guess multiple reasons, but it starts with the fact I think that first of all I'm British, and so I'm writing I think from a very particular British perspective on Europe. Britain notoriously has this kind of semi-detached relationship with Europe. And I've worked a lot on Germany, and it's always very clear to me that how you think about Europe is very different if you're at the center of Europe in the way that Germany is, than if you're on the periphery of Europe in the way that Britain is. And so I've sort of tried always to be upfront about the way in which that perspective has influenced my thinking on Europe. But then on top of the fact that I was born and grew up in Britain, I also have two parents who are immigrants to Britain. My father was Indian, my mother's Dutch. which sort of even further, I think, sort of complicates my relationship with Europe. You know, on the one hand, you know, because my mother's Dutch, I think in some ways I probably felt more European than a lot of other Brits who just had two parents from Britain. That made me feel, I think, a little bit more European than many Brits. But then on the other hand, because my father was Indian, you know, in other words, from a country outside of Europe, a country that was colonized by Britain, that always meant that I could only ever feel sort of partially European. I always felt as if the adjective European could never fully capture my identity in the way that it could for some people. I've heard, you know, some people, for example, refer to themselves as 100% European. By the way, that tends to be a description which people who have, say, you know, one parent who's French and one parent who's German, or, you know, they've married somebody from another European country, or, in other words, whose family biographies kind of cross these European boundaries, but only European boundaries. They're the ones, I think, that tend to think of themselves most as being European, and as I say, will tend to describe themselves as 100% European, this quite proud kind of way, right? That was a description which I could never really sort of identify with. So, you know, to sum all of that up, I think I basically have always thought of myself as being sort of partially European, partially but not fully European. And so I think I've always slightly had this kind of insider-outsider perspective on Europe, and I think that's probably informed the analysis in the book. And then the second kind of biographical element that really led to this book is a little bit what Kaija has already hinted at, which is that I spent the last sort of 15 years or so working in a series of foreign policy think tanks. And the first foreign policy think tank that I worked for is called the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is a very pro-European foreign policy think tank that is based in London but has offices in 6 other European capitals, and it aims to help Europe develop a more coherent, effective foreign policy. And when I started working there, which was in about 2009, I thought of myself at that time as being a pro-European. In other words, somebody who believes in European integration, in the European project, in the form that it currently has. And I thought that I knew about the EU, but in retrospect, I really didn't. And it was only really from then on, as I was working at that think tank, that I started to sort of understand more about the EU. And I started to come to the conclusion, this is really what led to the book, that a lot of what I'd been told by the EU, not least, you know, because a lot of what the EU has told the rest of the world about itself is actually, you know, myth rather than the real history of the EU. And in particular, I started to read a lot of the very interesting academic work, sort of challenging some of these assumptions about the history of the EU. And part of what led me to write the book was this increasing awareness that there was this massive gap between academia and this policy world that I was in, where people in this policy world just simply weren't aware of a lot of the academic work that has been done over the last sort of decade or so. And so part of the point of the book was to try to bring some of that academic work to a wider audience, a sort of translating kind of function almost. Yeah, that was part of the kind of the impetus behind the book. So that's the sort of the genesis of the book, and as I say, my sort of particular perspective. And really, what the book basically tries to do is it tries to look at the long history of ideas of Europe, going all the way back to the medieval period through to the present day EU, and to try to think about where the EU fits into that longer history of ideas of Europe. And so I start by challenging this idea that, which is quite, you know, widely held among pro-Europeans, that we should think of the EU as an expression of cosmopolitanism. This is, as I say, this is something which a lot of pro-Europeans believe, that that the EU is this uniquely cosmopolitan kind of project, and it's an expression of cosmopolitanism. And there are different ways of thinking about what cosmopolitanism is, and I won't get into that in too much detail, but I think cosmopolitanism has to have something to do with the whole world. And the reason I've always found it slightly odd to think of the EU as an expression of cosmopolitanism is that Europe is not the world, although there is this tendency, I think, amongst pro-Europeans and in the EU to almost mistake Europe for the world and think that you're talking about the world when you're actually talking about Europe. For example, you know, when people say, to come back to the identity question, when people say I'm European, they sometimes think that what they're saying when they say that is I'm a citizen of the world. I'm a global citizen, but obviously you're not saying that. You're saying I'm a citizen of this very particular region, which has a very particular history and a very particular relationship with the rest of the world. Similarly, if you think about European integration, you know, integrating the economies of Europe, that's not global integration. It's not integrating the world's economies. When you remove barriers to the movement of capital and goods and people in the context of European integration, that's only barriers to the movement of capital and goods and people within Europe. It's not global integration in that sense. But there is a tendency to think about it that way among pro-Europeans, that, you know, this is why you'll hear people say things like, you know, the EU stands for openness. Not just openness internally, but more broadly stands for openness. So I've always found this idea of the EU as an expression of cosmopolitanism to be a little bit misleading. And so instead, what I propose in the book is that we should think of the EU and of Europe and of European identity as being an expression of what I call regionalism, which is not the opposite of nationalism, which is how, as I say, that this is the implication of the idea of, you know, that the EU is an expression of cosmopolitanism, is that it's the opposite of nationalism. It's not really the opposite of nationalism. It's actually somewhat analogous to nationalism, except on a larger continental kind of scale. And there are multiple reasons why I think that's a helpful way to think about Europe as an expression of regionalism. But the main one is that what it means is that all of the intellectual tools that we have from the study of nationalism, we can then think about whether we can also apply those to this higher level, regional level. So, you know, famously, Benedict Anderson describes nations as imagined communities, right? So similarly, we can think of Europe as being an imagined community in a somewhat analogous kind of way. And in particular, the sort of tool from the study of nationalism that I find very helpful to apply to European regionalism is this distinction, which goes back to Hans Kundnani in 1944 in an early study of nationalism, between civic nationalism on the one hand and ethnic nationalism on the other hand. Now, the way he deploys that distinction, I think, is a little bit too simplistic, and in particular, he tends to think that you can talk about some kinds of nationalism as being purely ethnic and some kinds of nationalism as being purely civic. In particular, he sees American nationalism as being purely civic. I think he idealizes it a little bit too much. I think instead the way we should use that distinction is to think about each nationalism as having ethnic elements and civic elements, and they interact in kind of complex kind of ways, rather than thinking of, you know, some nationalisms as being exclusively civic and some as being exclusively ethnic. But with that caveat, I think this is actually still quite a helpful conceptual distinction to make. I also want to slightly qualify the ethnic nationalism and talk about ethnic/cultural nationalism, because I think in the history of ethnic nationalism, culture has always been part of it. It's not as if that's been separate. It hasn't ever been purely about race. Race and culture have tended to go together. So I make this distinction between ethnic, cultural nationalism on the one hand and civic nationalism on the other hand, and then apply that to European regionalism. And this is really the sort of conceptual framework for the book, to say that throughout the history of the idea of Europe, as I say, going back to the medieval period, there have always been these ethnic, cultural elements, and on the other hand, these civic elements as well. And so in a way, the story I try to tell is how those ethnic cultural elements and the civic elements interact. And in particular, how they interact after 1945, because the claim that a lot of pro-Europeans, well, it's not really a claim, the assumption that a lot of pro-Europeans would make is that the ethnic cultural elements of European identity sort of disappeared in 1945, right? And that the idea of Europe and the idea of European identity centered on the EU, what becomes the EU after 1945, is a purely civic one that has nothing to do with these older ethnic cultural ideas of Europe. And my argument is it very much does, and that's the story I try to tell. So I begin the story in classical antiquity, actually, where the idea of, the name Europe comes from, the idea of Europe as a space. But it's really in the medieval period that, that the idea of European identity, in other words, Europeans as people, first emerges. The first reference that we seem to have to people called Europeans is in something called the Mozarabic Chronicle. Was written around about 732 AD, and in that, it describes the Battle of Poitiers, and the context in which the term Europeans is used is explicitly contrasting the Franks, who are described as being Europeans, with Muslim forces who are described as being Arabs. So that's the first instantiation, as it were, of Europeanness is in contrast to Arabs. And I think what that illustrates is the way that in the medieval period, what it means to be European is roughly synonymous with what it means to be Christian. Europeanness and Christianity, Europe and Christendom are largely synonymous, and it's a fairly simple version of European identity in that period. The embodiment of that medieval idea of Europeanness that's synonymous with Christianity is Charlemagne, who then later on becomes this kind of inspirational figure for the post-World War II integration project. I'll come back to that later on. But I think already you can see that what it illustrates is that the Christian component of European identity never really goes away. It sort of continues even into the post-1945 period. What you then have, though, after the medieval period, once the modern period begins, is a new, much more complex idea of European identity. And in particular, it's rather than being a religious idea of Europe, as you have in the medieval period, it's a much more secular, rationalist idea of Europe. This emerges in the context of the European Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. But here's the thing. It also emerges in the context of the encounter of Europeans with the populations of Africa and Asia, and in particular the Americas, from 1492 onwards especially. In other words, the context in which the idea of whiteness emerges. And so this new modern idea of Europe is not just rationalist as opposed to religious, it's also racialized as opposed to religious. And it's very closely connected to the concept of whiteness. And I think, you can see that even now in the sort of common sense way in which the term white is used, right? It's very closely connected to the idea of Europeanness. It's roughly the way that we, when we talk about white people, we roughly mean people of European origin. That's roughly how the term is used, say, for example, in the United States. An even clearer example would be if you think about, say, apartheid South Africa, where you had all kinds of facilities, let's say, benches even, that were designated as being, for whites only or Europeans only. Sometimes the sign said whites only, sometimes the sign said Europeans only, but they were understood to mean the same thing. That was just taken for granted that they meant the same thing. So then the question becomes, and in a way this is really the question that the book tries to answer, is what happens after 1945? What happens to these ethnic cultural ideas of Europe, and in particular this connection between Europeanness and whiteness after 1945? As I suggested earlier, there's an assumption or a hope among pro-Europeans that they kind of just disappeared, and that you have this, that 1945 is a kind of hour zero kind of moment, that you get this completely new version of European identity that has nothing to do with these older ethnic cultural ideas, and that it's a purely civic idea of Europe. But I think the history shows it's much messier than that. I've already mentioned the example of Charlemagne, right? So if what you want to do after 1945 is show that we have this completely new idea of European identity, then picking the person who is the embodiment of this medieval idea of Christianity, of Europeanness, which is synonymous with Christianity rather, is a rather sort of odd choice of sort of figurehead or inspiration. But from the beginning, in the 1950s, he was the inspiration for the post-war integration project, and the embodiment of that is the Charlemagne Prize, which was first awarded in 1950 and continues to be awarded to this day for services towards European unification or something like that. And so it's the most prestigious prize for pro-Europeans, and it's awarded in the name of Charlemagne. So that, I think, as I say, already illustrates some of these continuities. But the next thing which we have to talk about, which illustrates even more of these continuities, is the way that, and here I'm really just building on work of other academics who have done this kind of historical excavation. We know now, it's very clear that in the 1950s, the first steps in European integration didn't just intersect with the end of the last phase of European colonialism, but they were actually part of the European colonial project. And in particular, at that time, France and Belgium still had these huge colonial territories in West and Central Africa, which they had every intention of holding on to at that point. And part of the point of European integration was to allow them to consolidate those colonies, to integrate, if you like, those colonies at a time when France and Belgium were no longer able to maintain them on their own. In particular, what they needed was an injection of West German capital. And so then in turn, for some people in West Germany, who Germany had lost all of its colonies after World War I, so several decades earlier. But for some in West Germany, this was a chance for them to get back into the colonial game that they'd been excluded from since then, which is partly why they were quite excited about it. And this is the whole context in which those first steps in European integration are taking place. And this has been completely written out of the story, the official story that the EU tells about European integration. And it's really only in the last decade or so that, as I say, historians have kind of started to excavate this and show that this is the part of the real history of that early phase of European integration. In particular, there's a book called Eurafrica by Pia Hansen and Stefan Jonsson, which came out almost a decade ago now, in 2014. And I mentioned at the beginning that part of my objective in writing the book or the impetus for writing the book was this sense that a lot of this academic work hadn't penetrated beyond academia. This is a perfect example. All my former colleagues at the European Council on Foreign Relations, who are experts on the EU and who'll be quoted in the Financial Times, the New York Times, and who think they really understand the EU, they simply don't know this history. Even though, as I say, Eurafrica, which in turn built on earlier scholarship, came out a decade ago. So I think of this now as being the kind of original sin of European integration, very consciously analogizing to the role of slavery in American history. So that's the period from 1945 to about 1960, where I think we can now say quite clearly that the EU was a colonial project. But, as I say, around about 1960, France and Belgium basically lose all of those colonies in West and Central Africa in the context of decolonization. And so I think that's the end of the period in which we can talk about the EU as being a colonial project. I think there's still a big outstanding question, which I don't get into particularly in the book, but there's lots of other people that do, about whether the EU becomes then a sort of neo-colonial project, right? That's a separate question. But as a formal colonial project, it really ceases to be that in around about 1960. And and so I think that from that moment on, you start to get the beginning of a new kind of European civic regionalism, as opposed to ethnic cultural. And in particular, it becomes centered on this economic model that emerges in the first several decades after World War II, the social market economy and the welfare state. But then also a sort of political model, a kind of depoliticized mode of governance, sort of technocratic mode of governance that European integration itself produces. Now, the social market economy and the welfare state are kind of interesting because actually, they're really being developed by, what become EU member states rather than by, the EEC or later the EU itself. But nevertheless, this becomes something that the EU starts to think of as being part of its own kind of identity. And then, as I say, the depoliticized mode of governance, it was very much a product of the EU itself. And so out of those two things, a kind of economic model and a political model, you start to get this, this civic idea of what Europe is, what it stands for in post-1945. And so pro-Europeans in the EU will start to talk about Europe standing for these things, for this particular economic model, by the way, partly in contrast to the United States, right? Or different model of capitalism in the United States, and this depoliticized mode of governance, which is seen as being kind of visionary, and perhaps even as a model for the whole world. But what then happens is that this history, not just of European colonialism itself, but the role of the EU in it, becomes then completely forgotten, as I mentioned, at precisely the moment when something else is happening, which is that the Holocaust is starting from the 1960s onwards to become an increasingly central collective memory in individual European countries, led by West Germany, but then also starts to become incorporated into the narrative of the EU itself. So this also becomes something which the EU really kind of takes on and starts to see as being part of its own identity, that we've learned the lessons from the Holocaust. And in particular, there's a way in which the sort of German engagement with the Nazi past and the Holocaust gets kind of uploaded to the European level. And so German lessons become sort of European lessons. And so what I think happens is that the EU increasingly starts to think of itself as being based on the sort of internal lessons of European history. In other words, the lessons of what Europeans had done to each other, centuries of conflict culminating in World War II and the Holocaust. But what you might call the external lessons of European history, what Europeans had done to others, and in particular European colonialism, is kind of completely forgotten. And so there's this increasing tendency, I think, to think about European history as a kind of a closed system, right? In other words, this is a completely self-contained history that goes from classical antiquity, ancient Greece and Rome, through the Renaissance, and then European Enlightenment, and then, as I say, these centuries of conflict, World War II, the Holocaust, the EU. And what gets lost is, the interactions of Europe with the rest of the world, the way that, non-Europeans influence Europe. I mean, the sort of presence of non-Europe within Europe, as it were, in particular the role that Africa and the Middle East at every stage of European history, the influence that they'd have, but also conversely, the presence of Europe in non-Europe, as I say, in particular, European colonialism. So that's, I think, roughly the story of what happens in the EU from, in that early phase from 1945 onwards, really until the end of the Cold War. This idea of the Holocaust becoming really central and the EU becoming almost a community of memory. I think that's really started to happen by the time the Cold War comes to an end. And then what I think you get in the sort of 20-year period after the end of the Cold War, so roughly from 1990 to about 2010, is a kind of a new phase in European integration. How am I doing for time? We're good. And this is the moment in which the EU is enlarging to include Central and Eastern European countries. So the EU is in this quite expansive, optimistic mode. And in that context, what starts to happen is that pro-Europeans start to almost imagine that the whole world can be remade in the image of the EU. So it's quite a hubristic kind of moment. My former boss at the European Council on Foreign Relations wrote a book at that time which really captures this this moment, and it was called "Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century." You know, this really optimistic, as I say, hubristic kind of mode. Did he present it here? Yeah. Now, there are at least two problems with that. The first is that it led, I think, to this kind of revival of the idea of a European civilizing mission. That's not a concept I've mentioned so far, but you know, this, I think, is one of the continuities in this long history of Europe. Certainly going back to the Enlightenment, the idea that Europe stands for a set of universal values, and that those should be exported to the rest of the world. I mean, this is really the essence of the kind of civilizing mission. And obviously you get that in the context of European colonialism. But what I think you get after 1990 is a sort of a new kind of postmodern technocratic version of that civilizing mission. In particular, the idea that Central and Eastern European countries, as part of the accession process, need to be essentially civilized. And that itself was drawing on older ideas going back to the Enlightenment about a kind of civilized Western Europe and a sort of uncivilized Eastern Europe. There was also in that period, you know, in the 1990s and 2000s, you start to get all these theories about the EU as a foreign policy actor, a particular kind of foreign policy actor. It's a civilian power or it's a normative power, right? And these, in a way, these theories have a similar kind of tone to them, which is that, you know, the EU is actually civilizing international politics itself, right? So that, I think that's the first slightly troubling thing about this moment is that it leads to a revival of a European civilizing mission. But the second thing that's really problematic about it is that, you know, even as the EU is enlarging to the east, and so the eastern borders of the EU are becoming very soft, its borders to the south remain very hard. So, for example, in 1987, before the end of the Cold War, Morocco actually applies to join what is then the EC. And it's just told flatly that you can't because you're not a European state. So you get this sort of simultaneous kind of softening of borders to the east and the borders to the south remaining hard. And I think what that means is that it strengthens actually the idea that this is a white bloc, right? Because you know, these countries in the Central and Eastern Europe, they have to be civilized, but they can, in principle, join the EU. So the way I put it in the book is they're not yet Europe, but they can become Europe. But you know, Morocco just can never become Europe. And then Turkey is a different case again, you know, and it fits quite neatly, I think, into this kind of contrast between the East and the South because it sits, you know, between the two, right, in Southeastern Europe. And so Turkey, unlike Morocco, is allowed to apply. But then during the accession process, it becomes very clear that the reason the reason there's resistance, particularly in France and Germany, to Turkey becoming a member is not just that it's not doing all the structural reforms that it's required to do, but also for more sort of civilizational kinds of reasons. There's a fantastic quote from 2004 when Frits Bolkestein, who he'd been a European commissioner from the Netherlands for I think about a decade at that time. And he says that if Turkey were allowed to join the EU, it would mean, quote, that the liberation of Vienna in 1683 would have been in vain, right? You know, illustrating that there's something very kind of civilizational going on. And also, you know, illustrating, as I say, that kind of medieval idea of, you know, Europe as Christian, you know, is very much alive. And I think what actually happens is it gets revived after 9/11. I mean, this is a couple of years after 9/11. Bolkestein is saying that. And I think this is the first critical juncture that leads to this kind of revival of civilizational thinking in the EU. So anyway, that's the sort of 20-year period from the end of the Cold War until about 2010. But then I think this kind of expansive, optimistic kind of period comes to an end quite suddenly with the beginning of the Euro crisis in 2010. And then I think the EU enters a kind of a new phase, which roughly lasts until now. And so this is really the final section of the story I tell, the final chapter of the story I tell about the sort of evolution of the EU. And this is what I call the civilizational turn in the European project. And I think it basically happened in two sort of phases. The first is that after the Euro crisis began in 2010, and then very quickly after that, there were a series of other crises that the EU had to deal with. There was the Arab Spring in 2011, and then you get this more aggressive Russia. You have the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And so this series of crises leads to the EU starting to go into a much more kind of defensive mode. It'd been in this outward-looking, expansive kind of mode for 20 years, but it kind of falls back into this defensive mode after 2010, and it starts to see itself as being surrounded by threats. And so you start to get this whole new discourse around protection and defense. But then what happens in the sort of second stage of this, I think the second really important critical juncture is the refugee crisis in 2015. And I think that, and this is why I talk about the civilizational turn, I think what then starts to happen is that the EU starts to interpret all the threats to it in civilizational terms. I mentioned already 9/11. There was already starting to be this tendency to think in civilizational terms then. I think after the refugee crisis begins in 2015, this goes much further. Against the background of the rise of the far right, really across Europe, and in a way as important as the rise of the far right itself, the way that the centre right, I mean, to some extent even the centre left, but certainly the centre right, starts to kind of mimic the rhetoric and policies of the far right. So it normalizes and mainstreams a lot of far right kind of ideas, particularly on these questions of identity and immigration and Islam. The main policy area where this really plays out is in migration refugee policy. And I can say more about that in the discussion afterwards, but it's really shocking to me at least how, since 2015, how EU policy in the Mediterranean has evolved. 28,000 people have now died in the Mediterranean, trying to cross the Mediterranean since 2014. And to me, since we're in the United States, to me, EU policy feels actually very similar to the kind of policy that Donald Trump was pursuing when he was US president, right? Build the wall. The difference is that this is, it's not a land border like you have on the southern border of the United States. It's a sea border, the Mediterranean. But it's a roughly similar kind of policy, I think. Human Rights Watch just had a report which said you can summarize EU refugee policy in 3 words: let them die. And I think that's about right. But it's not just the brutality of the policy itself that's so shocking to me. It's the way in which it's framed, right? So in the European Commission now, the current European Commission, the von der Leyen Commission, which began in 2019, there is a European Commissioner for promoting the European way of life. And that person's job is, at least in part, to keep migrants out, right? Which makes this civilizational framing very, very explicit. It makes it clear that this is, migration is not just a difficult policy problem to be managed, but it's a threat to the European way of life. So refugee policy, you can see this very, very clearly, I think, the civilizational turn. But I think it's also starting to be manifested in European foreign policy debates. And this was the area, this was the space that I used to work in. There's increasingly this tendency to think about international politics as being a clash of civilizations, and that Europe is a kind of distinct civilization, distinct, by the way, also from the United States. This is the way that Emmanuel Macron in particular talks about the need for European strategic autonomy and so on. is in these kind of civilisational terms. And so that all leads me to the conclusion, to circle back to where I began with this distinction between ethnic cultural ideas of Europe on the one hand and civic ideas of Europe on the other hand, that it may actually now be that these ethnic cultural elements of European identity, far from getting weaker, are actually getting stronger. That, in a way, was the sort of the political urgency. The reason I was writing the book was to try to alert pro-Europeans to at least that possibility that the ethnic cultural elements of European identity are getting stronger. And it's those ethnic cultural elements of European identity closely connected to the idea of whiteness that I call Eurowhiteness.
I'm in a relatively awkward position where I don't have a little thing to put this down, and I'm like collecting everything in my lap. I'll put this down now. There we go.
I want to be able to move around a little bit more. All right. So one of the reasons we were late is we were nerding out in my office talking about this book, because I wasn't exaggerating when I said that I've been waiting 20 years. Other people might have been waiting longer in the room for this kind of book to come out, and for someone to be a truth teller, or I was saying like a de Tocqueville, on this topic, looking at something and kind of actually saying some really authentic things, authentic observations in very big picture ways about what they're observing. And so I wanted to just tell a couple anecdotes to explain to you as an audience what I meant by that. And then I have a few questions for Hans. And I'm also, oh yes, I apologize. I was trying not to, yeah, thank you. So I was saying I've been waiting for 20 years for this, and that this is something that I'm a conversation that I am excited to have. And the reasons for this are that I have been observing similar conversations to Hans over the last 20 years. For example, and I feel kind of like I've been gaslit in this space, because there are comments that come out of the EU sphere that to me have always sounded incredibly civilisational, or even very identity adjacent about race or ethnicity. And I've never been able to label it, because it is something that has been without category a little bit. Because if you say, oh, that sounds like you're making an identity argument, people will say back to you, no, there is no European identity, it's just a civic identity. It's just something that happens when you participate in European political institutions, or when you get the material benefits of membership in the EU. If you participate in the Erasmus exchange project and perhaps marry another European, then you feel European, right? It is always put in these very polite terms. But that has always been very hard to align with the reality of the things I've heard as an observer adjacent to EU affairs. I recall a lot of when I was doing my dissertation field work, and I would sit in defense industry conferences, places where there'd be kind of a public-private conversation where there'd be think tankers, but there'd be a lot of defense industry people trying to kind of have a conversation about what European defense or EU defense might look like. And no, that's not in 2022. That was in 2006 or 2007 or 2008. And I have a little packet in my office of the kinds of flyers I collected, physical at that point in time still, of defense industries or defense firms trying to sell products to European governments with maps of Europe, and then dark stick figures kind of coming up, threatening the continent. And I haven't really been able to articulate this. I never wrote a book about it. I just kept a file about it, right? About these images, these glossy things that European defense contractors would use to invoke these images of something civilisational, something, and they would always be dark figures, of course. And I was too cowardly, I think, to write about it at the time. I didn't know what to make of it. And I also didn't have a category for it. Similar to that, I've often felt kind of like a elephant has no, or not elephant, sorry, emperor has no clothes, elephant in the room person. Just this year, or no, it was last year at a European Studies conference, an EU Studies conference, a lovely researcher was asking the question, genuinely, in political science, we operate in puzzles. You know, why did this happen and this not happen? Why is there a difference between this and this? Why is there variation? And these lovely researchers, who were very polite and very intelligent, were asking the question with straight faces, why did the EU distribute vaccines inside Europe and even have a massive fiscal spending project to generate all kinds of resources for COVID response inside Europe? And why did they not distribute vaccines outside Europe as much? I mean, we were sitting in there puzzling that over for an hour. And I kind of feel like this jerk always when I raise my hand and I say, well, could it be civilisational? Could it be identity-based? Could there be a there? And it's always been this thing that you kind of grasp at as a potential explanation. And then to add on to that, there's a lot of really good but very atheoretical work that's coming out in the social sciences. It's very data-driven, experimental research that says, you know, if someone is shown this image, how do they respond? If someone is shown this image, how do they respond, right? So a lot of experimental survey work. And it's very precisely causally specified, like you know that X causes Y. And there's been a real weight of all this coming out, where we now know from a lot of studies that if someone is shown, if a European is shown a picture of a migrant in the Mediterranean, and it depends on what color their skin tone is, perhaps, there is a causal effect on their support for European defense or something like that, right? There's something there. We know it. But it's made me feel a little bit crazy because I've seen the evidence for this thing grow and grow and grow, empirically, in my own experience, and also as kind of a hidden variable or an unexplained explanation. But there hasn't been theoretical work here. There hasn't been conceptual work to say there is something about identity in this space. And no, we are not saying that there is a European nationalism. We are not saying that Europe as a nationalist force is going to go invade somewhere or go fight and die for their identity. But it has an effect. There is some kind of effect there. And so one of the reasons we were late is because we were talking about that. And so in order to, I mean, you can respond to that if you'd like to the group, but I have kind of a specific question that comes up from that.
No,
okay, great. So we were talking about how, just like that observation, that there's definitely something there, but there's little evidence for it. We were talking about how Hans's book is called Eurowhiteness, but it's not actually about whiteness on every page. It's about how other explanations are insufficient for a lot of what we're seeing. It's about how there are processes at work where you have to strip away other explanations, and we're kind of left with there being something there that's identitarian, that's civilisational, and that one of the raw things coming into it, in addition to perhaps Christianity as a identity, is racial or identity-based. And we were just having that conversation. And because I think one of the critiques that came in, the critical reviews said, you don't actually provide evidence that it's actually whiteness doing the work. And then Hans said, well, actually, there is rarely ever evidence of whiteness. It's not measured. It's not theorized in many spaces, either theoretically or empirically. And if you think about how these kinds of things work, there's almost never evidence for something. And so the comment I wanted to add, and I have to be very careful in this, but people who I know who didn't get tenure, who might be people of color, have been able to win lawsuits against institutions like universities when there's no evidence that anyone said, we didn't give them tenure because they're Black, right? But in the absence of other explanations for why they didn't get tenure, it's a legitimate argument, and there's enough validity and weight to that legally. It's a good enough argument for the courts, And so it's a good enough argument for me. So I wanted you to reflect on that.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I mean, I've obviously been having a lot of conversations in the last 2 months since the book came out about it, and one of the discussions is precisely around whether whiteness specifically, but more broadly race, is a sort of an appropriate, helpful way of thinking about Europe. You know, there's a tendency to think that, you know, I hear this in particular from people in France, that this is a sort of an American import, right? That it's okay to talk about the history of European colonialism. So in other words, you know, empire is something that we can talk about in Europe. But race, that's really an American kind of idea. Maybe also Britain, you know, but that this isn't really a helpful kind of way of thinking about Europe. I think it really is, and I think that where we're sort of at is that we have now a lot of work on whiteness, but most of it is precisely in the American context. And so I think what's missing, and you know, I'm not claiming to have filled this gap, but sort of pointing to the gap almost is part of the point of the book, is to say we need to have more work on the history of whiteness in the European context. And as just one sort of, you know, very simple illustration of how, you know, it absolutely, you know, functioned in the European context too. If you think about the Code Noir, which is the edict, the French edict governing slavery in French colonies, you know, it explicitly uses the language of black and white, of color. So the idea that somehow, you know, this wasn't, you know, this is just an American story, the sort of black-white contrast, that type of racialized thinking, I just don't think is right. The other reason why I think some people want to sort of say race is not helpful in the European context is there's long been this idea that class kind of plays something of the role in Europe that race does in the United States. Again, I think it's more complicated than that. I think you have a sort of complicated story about race and class in both Europe and the United States. But I think broadly, I think of you know, I think of this as being, you know, one story rather than you know, rather than two separate stories, really. Not least, obviously, because the United States starts out as a British colony.
So I'm going to limit myself to one more question, and then I'll open it up, just letting everyone know. So I'm curious, and this is not a critique of the book, because I take you very seriously that you are starting the conversation, not ending it. If you are going to start conceptualizing whiteness in Europe, there are internal hierarchies, of course, of what we mean by whiteness, right? There are hierarchies within that category of white. And you don't go there, and that's fine. That's for your next book, right? And this is something that also empirical evidence or experimental evidence has shown that if a Dutch person is primed, they think of Italians as a little less white, and then, you know, and then it goes on from there. And not to pick on Dutch people in particular, I was just thinking of like from north to south or something. And I wanted to center myself one last time and say I was just telling Hans about this in my office too, my first academic paper that I wrote as a graduate student in a seminar and then published more than 10 years later, I think 12 years later or something, was kind of hinting at these internal hierarchies, right? That inside-outside that does shift, that there was enough of a fungible boundary to the east that the Central and Eastern Europeans eventually became whiter, right? In the same way that Irish became whiter, or Germans or Italians became whiter in the United States, right? Yeah. But my first graduate school paper, which ended up being my first academic paper, which sat in a drawer for 10 years, was that the European Commission in 2004, when the Central and Eastern European states became EU members, the European Commission deployed a survey, an individual survey called the Eurobarometer, to citizens in those countries for the first time. They used to give them a different survey that was, of course, more Orientalist, I think, as in, you know, do you like democracy or something like that? But they now gave them the survey that the individuals inside the EU got. And they had a result that shocked the European Commission so much that they ran the survey again. And then they got a similar result. And the result was that people who were in Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, more people there felt European than inside the Western European states. And this blew up. I mean, they weren't academics at the Commission, but it also did not compute with academics either, because remember, EU is what produces European identity in a civic way. And so that result was interesting to me, but what enraged me was you're hearing this twice, Hans, sorry, was the press release that came with that result in 2004. And it said, we, the Commission, surveyed Central and Eastern European individuals, and we found that they reported themselves as more European. And we don't think that's actually authentically possible. They must have been aspirationally answering the question, right, as one does, as a grandmother in Warsaw does, right, when she's being asked these questions. They must have been aspirationally answering because they wanted to get the material benefits of joining the EU. And then that gave me enough of a temper tantrum that I went and I did some statistics, actually, which I don't really do that much now, but to demonstrate that the people who were saying that they felt more European were not pro-EU and not cosmopolitan in that way. And so I didn't really know what too much to do with that result, but now we have a theory to attach to it, right?
Yeah, so look, I totally agree that there's a lot more work to be done in conceptualizing, I guess for me in particular, the relationship between whiteness and Europeanness, right? Because I think in the work that mostly has been done on whiteness in American context, that isn't particularly kind of conceptualized. And for me, and one of the sort of key questions there that I've been trying to sort of think about since the book came out is does whiteness unite Europeans or does it divide Europeans? And it sort of does both, right? But I do think that overall, part of the function of whiteness is actually to actually erase the differences between Europeans and play up the differences between Europeans collectively and others. And I think that functions, I'm still sort of thinking this through, but I think it functions kind of on an individual level in the United States. So when you come to the let's say you migrate to the United States from, let's say, Poland, you become white, right, in the process of becoming American. And I think something analogous takes place at a sort of almost a national level in Europe as part of the accession process, right? You sort of become fully white by joining the EU. And that brings me to the more specific thing that you're alluding to around Central and Eastern Europeans in particular. Because I borrow this term, Eurowhiteness, from a American sociologist, Josef Boros, originally Hungarian. And the way he uses the concept in a paper that he wrote is precisely to capture this, what he calls a sort of internal hierarchy within whiteness. And in particular, he contrasts Euro-whiteness with what he calls dirty whiteness, which is precisely this kind of aspirational kind of mode where you're not fully white and therefore insecure about your whiteness, and you want to become fully white. And he applies it, as I say, in particular to Central and Eastern Europeans. And so I think so as I say, I use it in a slightly, I don't think incompatible way, but a slightly different way, which is just to designate this ethnic cultural version of European identity. But the story that I tell about the accession process, it seems to me roughly has two sides. One is this way in which, as I mentioned earlier, that from the EU's perspective, it thinks it's civilizing Central and Eastern European countries, which you can then, I think, see in terms of this contrast between Euro whiteness and dirty whiteness. It's cleaning them, right, to follow the metaphor through. But then I think there is also another side to it, which I think is important to emphasize, which if we think about it from the perspective of Central and Eastern European countries, In other words, not from the perspective of the EU. What do they think is happening during this process? I think this phrase that was always used, to return to Europe, this was a phrase that was used in these countries quite a lot. It's really interesting. It's a sort of enigmatic phrase, right? People mention this all the time, that this was the way they thought of this. They were returning to Europe. But very rarely do people actually interrogate, what did that mean? And in particular, what kind of Europe were they returning to, right? Because if what we mean by Europe is just, if Europe just means the EU, the post-World War II integration process and the European Union, then Central and Eastern European countries were not returning to it in the 2000s because they'd never been part of it, right? So if there's a return to Europe, it must be some older idea of Europe that they were somehow part of before they were, before 1945, right? And I would suggest, and Quinn's written about this as well, I would suggest that this is a civilisational kind of ethnic cultural idea of Europe. And so there's a way in which I think we can understand the return to Europe as a return to whiteness.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm so glad I asked you those questions. I'm excited to take audience questions now. If you don't mind introducing yourself. Vivian?
If students want to talk first. No? Okay, yeah, I loved the talk. I really like the book a lot. But I want to push back a little just for
please.
fun. And I think you give too much credit to the EU.
I love it.
Too much, giving it too much agency, making it appear as if they all think the same way.
Yeah.
And that there's actually something coherent about the EU, as opposed to it being, there's no real there, and it becomes sort of the result of conflicts amongst countries' inability actually to take action. Certainly that's immigration policy. And I was just thinking, then on the other hand, you keep using the word civilisational, which I think is really good, but isn't it also racist? Certainly if one's talking about not about North Africa, although to be perfectly honest, I think we can understand not integrating North Africa because that's not geographically Europe. And the one big argument that people made is, other continents can have their own regional integration. We want to push that for everyone else, but we can't go as far, except in the UK. Tony Blair thought that he could just be one big market going all the way around the world and even incorporating the US. And then I always jokingly say, yeah, but the US can't be a member because it has capital punishment. So rights, civilizing mission, perhaps there. But in terms of the racist argument, you can certainly, if you look at what happens with the EU accepting Ukrainian refugees with open arms, in contrast to especially North Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, so blacks and Arabs, but but it's interesting. And now back to is there really such agency, or is there a there on the discrimination or racism stuff? There's a survey that just came out that listed countries, and what's interesting is the worst country on racism of all kinds is Austria, and then they're all Northern European. Finland, Germany's up there, and the least racist or least objectionable, I guess, is Portugal.
Which survey is
Portugal, and it's one that just came out.
Yes, no.
Right. But so but this also made me think of a study by Riva Castoriano in the early 2000s, Negotiating Identities, where she interviewed, I can't remember where, France, probably Germany, and maybe the Netherlands or Belgium. And what she found is that immigrants there who felt that they really couldn't assimilate in those countries, nonetheless felt much more European and much more accepted at the EU level than at the national. So I think, so what I'm trying to do is sort of mix this up a bit and say it's very complicated. And so that to just argue that it's civilisational, and yet at the same time, I like the fact that you call it civilisational rather than racist, because it's not, I mean, not everyone is racist, and there are different ways of thinking about what goes on in different European countries. Yeah, and one of the issues here, and I think I'll stop then, is isn't it about assimilating European values and also the values of within each member state? And the serious problem, I think, in Europe that also is part of the rise of the extreme right is the issue of people of Muslim background who are seen as not willing to assimilate or essentially even become part of the multicultural reality.
Yeah. Great.
What do you prefer? A few comments at once, or and then kind of reflecting a little bit?
Sure. Yeah,
Okay.
let's do that.
Let's do that. Yeah, because I want people to have a chance, and then to give Hans a second.
And I don't have all the answers.
Right,
so,
exactly. I mean,
certainly not civilians.
you might need another 3 minutes.
Yeah.
My name is Estelle Brun, and I'm a PhD student in political science at BU. My question kind of echoes what Professor Schmidt just said, which is about your conceptualization, and I haven't read the book, and I'm really excited about it. I look forward to reading it. It's about your conceptualization of pro-Europeans.
Yeah.
And I think you did say in the beginning what it meant, and I was puzzled by the fact that you said some pro-Europeans, or among them, think that when they say I'm European, it means I'm a citizen of the world.
Yeah.
And I think, yeah, this is like kind of a very like static understanding, I guess, of what pro-Europeans would be, especially as you have shown that what the EU or Europeanness has been, like, has really changed over time. Some things have stayed the same, but some things have changed. So
yeah.
What is pro-European?
Yeah.
And I guess, why did you choose to understand Europe through the lens of pro-Europeans? And to what extent does it represent what all Europeans think of Europe? Thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sandra Schilde, and I'm an assistant professor at the Pardee School. And sorry for walking in the dark late, I got stuck in traffic. But I want to ask a little bit about the current iteration and reproduction of whiteness in Europe, and particularly about the push between the European Commission as an institution versus its member states. Like, how are these is it the institution that's driving and reproducing this narrative, or is it the states, and particularly the major states like France and Germany, that are doing this and which haven't at all dealt with these questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
That's
Thanks.
great.
Should I throw one more on the pile?
Yeah, sure.
I'm Quinn Slobodian. I teach at Wellesley College, but if everything goes right, I'll be teaching here in the spring. So obviously I love the book. I read it in draft and I read the final version, and I think it's great. I wanted to say a couple of things though. One, I think is, and it's sort of related to what Kaija was saying in response to your talk. One is about there having been no conversation about this that one could build alternative theories onto, right? I mean, of course, that's not true, right? I mean, there is a whole field called post-colonial studies that is specifically about this. Ethnic studies is about this, and often about this in the European context. So it's more that political scientists and people in the think tank world have chosen not to pay attention to whole fields, rather than that those fields haven't existed, right? So I take part of Hans's translation work is to sort of not just tweak the noses, but hopefully kind of enlighten your former colleagues as to their own blind spots. And so I think insofar as the book is a kind of primarily about that, you kind of just want to enlighten and then partially expose the hypocrisy of the pro-European think tank world that you had once been part of, and to say, like, how have you ignored all of this? And so in that sense, I think it's very successful. I want to kind of join Vivian in playing a bit of devil's advocate, though, and argue that maybe you're judging the EU by an overly high standard, right? I mean, if in absolute terms, clearly it's true that Europeanism in its official or its vernacular forms is not cosmopolitanism in the full sense of that word, right? Given the political alternatives that exist currently in the world, is it more cosmopolitan than most of the other forms of political organization and identity? Yeah. And if so, is it worth defending despite all of the things that you write about in the book, right? Like, so net, could one take on board everything you've written and still come away defending a version of the European project?
I think
that's plenty, yeah.
That's plenty, exactly.
So thank you. These are all great questions, and in a way, I'm glad we took them all at once because they all sort of connect in some interesting kind of ways. So I'll start with Vivian, but in a way, this also gets to the third question. Sorry, I didn't catch your name. About the Commission and member states, right? Because I think in different ways, what you're both saying, or part of what you were saying, Vivian, was, there's a lot of complexity here, right? And I struggled with this a bit when I was working on the book because I wanted to write a relatively short book, partly to reach a broader audience. But it's quite hard to do that with the EU because there is so much complexity, right? So, there's the different member states, and you have to write about a lot of them, right? If not all of them, and then there are the EU institutions. And so there is clearly a much more complex story. There's a much longer version of this book that I could have written that I think would do more justice to that complexity. And that sort of gets to your point, Vivian, about agency. Am I giving the EU too much agency? I mean, I try within the sort of amount of space that I have and the sort of limits of the book, not to try to suggest that there is some master plan in the Commission or someplace else that's driving this, but precisely as I think you suggested, Vivian, that what the way that EU has evolved is the result of this complex interaction between these different actors, right? Between different member states, between the member states and the EU institutions. Also, by the way, another element which hasn't come in so far is between elites and publics, right? Because this is a largely elite-driven project and always has been, but it's having to respond in different kinds of ways to the public, not least in the form of Euroscepticism. And so, as I say, I think there's a more complex version of that story. But I'm certainly, I certainly agree that that's the way you have to think about it. And just to give you a couple of examples of that, I mean, in the story of the civilizational turn that I describe, in particular, so in other words, what's happened in the last decade or so, I try to at least, hint at this by showing that, you get, what I think has produced the civilizational turn is this kind of complex interaction between, in particular, Merkel and Macron and Orban and their different visions of Europe, and then the EU institutions, right? So the von der Leyen Commission, which I mentioned, which I think has sort of implemented, as it were, the civilizational turn in some ways, whether it's in terms of refugee policy or the European Commissioner for promoting the European way of life that I mentioned, I think is responding to this kind of complex negotiation that was going on between Merkel and Macron and Orban. And to get to sort of go into even more detail, I talk about Macron's vision of l'Europe qui protège, the Europe that protects, right? Which I argue starts out actually as a kind of center-left vision because it's about economic protection from the market. And then what happens is that Merkel basically just ignores his proposals for Eurozone reform. And then he reinvents l'Europe qui protège in more civilizational ways, right? So it's about cultural protection. And then, as I say, then von der Leyen picks up on that, with the idea of protecting the European way of life, and then it becomes promoting, but it's originally protecting the European way of life. So, so the way I describe the civilizational turn is that I think, or the EU that's emerged from the last decade or so, is this kind of compromise essentially between, it's neoliberal in economic terms, which I think is Merkel's influence. It's protectionist in cultural terms, which is Orban's influence. And as I say, Macron kind of, was trying to sort of navigate his way through this and meets resistance from Germany and then goes more in the Orban direction. And so do you see what I mean? There's these complex ways in which they're interacting. Now, I agree that's probably only just scratching the surface, and there's an even more complex story to be told. And maybe others will pick up on that. A couple of your other points, Vivian, I guess on racism and civilizationalism, I don't have a very clear kind of sort of way of thinking about the relationship between them, except to say that I think, in the long history of racism, civilization has often been there. I find it very difficult, to differentiate in the history of racism between, biological race, culture, and religion, especially in the European context. It seems to me it's always been about all three of these things. And so similarly, racism in a narrower sense and civilizationalism, I don't quite know how to sort of, draw a clear distinction between those two, except that it does seem to me that in the sort of post-1945 kind of context, there has been somewhat of a shift. Other people have written about this, from thinking about, biology to thinking about culture. And so I think that, I think often what we see now, even from the far right, is more like civilizationalism than, a narrower form of racism that is based entirely on biology. I don't even think that most of the far right talks in those terms anymore. So I think civilizationalism is probably the most useful way of thinking about this. I did want to push back against your idea, Vivian, that North Africa is not geographically Europe. That seems to me a much more complex, that is the common sense now, but that has been constructed in all kinds of ways. I mentioned, the way in which, in the Treaty of Rome, included, Algeria was specifically named, right? This is why the rejection of the Moroccan application is so striking, right? Because, the EU has included, or its predecessors have included, territory in North Africa. Now, that was in the context of, when there were colonial possessions. So apparently the only way that you can have, that North Africa can be Europe is by being a European colony. Algeria wasn't even a colony. It was part of metropolitan France, exactly. It was département. And now you have, these two Spanish enclaves in Morocco, Ceuta and Melilla, which are part of the EU. And that's before we even get onto, Europe that's in the Caribbean and elsewhere, right? So I guess what I'm saying is I think that's far from straightforward, the idea that, that North Africa is not geographically Europe. I think that's a much more complex kind of story, actually. And the story of Algeria in particular, I think, shows very clearly. It's a great book by Megan Brown, The Seventh Member State, that came out a year or so ago. It shows very clearly how, the French choose to think of Algeria as being part of Europe when they want to, and not Europe when they want to as well. So I suppose I want to sort of slightly challenge that. On your capital punishment point, I mentioned theories of Europe as a normative power, right? Ian Manners, specifically mentions capital punishment as one of the as this case study of Europe as a normative power. So I think that is really central. Okay, Estelle, on the term pro-European. So yeah, several people have sort of not just since the book came out, but even before then, when I've been using that term, pro-Europeans don't like it when I use the term pro-European. And here, I could talk for a long time about this. It gets quite nerdy, but I guess what the brief version would be this. First of all, so I put the term in quotes, first of all. And the reason for that is that this is a term that, as I say, this is a designation that pro-Europeans themselves have created, right? This isn't I didn't invent this. This is a way that, it's a category that pro-Europeans have themselves created to describe themselves, right? And it's very funny, some of the people that have criticized me for it themselves use the term pro-European. And so what becomes very clear is that they don't have a problem with the term pro-European. They have a problem with people criticizing pro-Europeans. Now, I do accept that there is some complexity here, which partly has to do with what you hinted at, which is how, the EU unusually, as a polity, is a polity that's a process, right? So what the EU is now is not what it was, previously. That's built into the logic of European integration. So that does make it a little bit complex. But I nevertheless think that there is a relatively straightforward definition, which is people who believe in the process of European integration in its current form. Because I think you can imagine a completely different version of European integration. I think those people wouldn't tend to be called pro-Europeans. If you said, I want to completely abolish the EU and start from scratch and create a different European integration process, you wouldn't normally be thought of as being a pro-European. So I think it has to be, people who support the European integration process in its current form and basically want it to go further. I think that's relatively straightforward. And the final thing I'll say is that, clearly there is a grey area. The boundaries of it are slightly unclear. But is it really any less clear than any of the other terms that we use? Conservatives, liberals, populists, nationalists. I mean, all of our terms, it's not entirely clear who would be described as that and who wouldn't. So to me, it seems, as unproblematic as they are. And if anything, it's less problematic because, as I say, it's a term that people use about themselves. So, in a way, a very simple definition of pro-Europeans is people who think of themselves as being pro-Europeans. I guess I'll stop there on that. And then, what have I missed? But Quinn, so look, I totally agree that post-colonial studies has been looking at some of these questions. But again, one of the things that slightly prompted me to want to join the dots a bit here is, on the one hand, that what both of you have mentioned, which is the way that European studies seem to be unaware of a lot of this stuff. But conversely, that post-colonial studies, it seems to me, has had a little bit of a Anglo-American bias, or a Commonwealth focus, as a post-colonial scholar put it to me the other day, right? There's been this tendency to sort of focus on the English-speaking world, basically, in post-colonial studies. And so it does seem to me that there's also a little bit of a blind spot in post-colonial studies, which is that Europe has been a little bit of an absence, even though that, there has been work on Europe, and Gayatri Spivak describes herself as a Europeanist. And so it is kind of there. But I haven't seen until very recently many post-colonial scholars engage, for example, with the European Union, right? From a post-colonial perspective. That's now just about. Sorry. Kind of, yes, kind of, yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. And then just the last point on your question about, are we judging the EU by too high a standard? Is it more cosmopolitan than other forms of political organization? That's a really good question. I haven't thought about it in those terms before, whether it's more cosmopolitan. I do think that actually it's a really interesting question whether, for example, nation states have more cosmopolitan potential than the EU or vice versa. I don't know the answer to that question. I would love to think about that more. I think we've taken it for granted that it was the other way around, right? That the EU had more cosmopolitan potential. A lot of this has been around, say, questions around borders, right? This is part of the sort of cosmopolitan Europe idea, the idea that what the EU does is debordering. And I think now it's become clear that it's also rebordering, right? That in a way, the sort of flip side of having no internal borders is you have a hard external border. And so in that context, I'm no longer sure, actually, whether you know, whether the EU has even more cosmopolitan potential. And and to come back to the concept of whiteness, I do think there's something very interesting about the connection between whiteness and Europeanness that I've been talking about, which actually might mean that it has less cosmopolitan potential, because I think that relationship between Europe and whiteness is actually tighter conceptually, historically, than the relationship between, say, Frenchness and whiteness, or between, Britishness and whiteness. Those benches in South Africa couldn't have said French only, right? It wouldn't have made any sense. They had to say Europeans only. So I wonder actually if there's a way in which Europeanness might be a more exclusive category than any nation state. But more importantly than that, though, in a way, is, if all I was saying was the EU wasn't perfect, and the review that Andy Moravchik just did in Foreign Affairs kind of ended with this, saying, it's useful to point out that the EU is not a utopia. That's not my argument. That, as I mentioned towards the end of my talk, the political imperative for writing it was not that the EU is not perfect, but that it might be regressing. Right? That, to me, is the shocking thing. One would think that the ethnic cultural elements of European identity would gradually get weaker over time. And for example, I think in the context of, say, I won't speak for any other EU member state, but in the context, I think in British identity, I think that is what's happening. The ethnic cultural components are becoming less and less pervasive, and the civic components are gradually becoming stronger and stronger. And I think 20, 30 years ago, you would have said the same thing about the EU. What's so shocking to me, and this is why I keep talking about the civilisational turn, is this possibility, at least, that the ethnic cultural elements might be getting stronger. So to put it in a way in the terms that you put, the question is not so much, is it more cosmopolitan than other entities? But the question is, it's becoming less cosmopolitan over time. That's the point I'm trying to make, I guess.
All right.
I'll stop there, I think, for the moment, unless there are more questions.
Elizabeth, time? Should we have time for a few more? Or are we wrapping? Sorry? Okay, so Elizabeth wants to build in time for you to sign some
Sure.
books then.
If
So
anyone wants me to,
there's time
yeah.
for individual
Yeah,
questions
great.
while you're signing them. All
Sounds
right,
good.
Please join me then.
Anyone who didn't get a book.
Thank you.